Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see you here at a packed house at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Barbara Perry, and I direct the Presidential Studies program here, and I'm also the Gerald Beliles Professor of Presidential Studies. We want to welcome you to the 23rd Annual Henry J. Abraham Distinguished Lecture to be delivered today by Judge J. Michael Luttig. He joins a list of renowned lecturers, including some who are with us today: General William Souter, Professor Tinsley Yarborough, and Dean John Jeffries have all spoken at the Abraham Lecture in Henry's honor. I want to thank my colleagues, especially here at the Miller Center, because without them, we couldn't be in this beautiful setting and enjoy all the services that the Miller Center it makes available to us. And that starts with Bill Antholis, our director. He is so sorry not to be here today. He's traveling for the Miller Center out in California. But Howard Witt, the head of communications here, I want to thank him, who had the idea and said, why don't you invite Judge Luttig? And I said, that's great. Henry loved him. That would be super to have him. And he said, yes, thanks also to Mike Hirschland, who was a clerk for Judge Luttig and helped us to acquire him for today. Also want to thank Christina Lopez-Guittardi, Alfred Reeves IV, who's standing in the back and will collect your questions. Alfred is joined today. Alfred is Alfred Reeves IV. He is joined by Alfred Reeves II and Alfred Reeves III today, along with his grandmother, Mrs. Alfred Reeves. Also want to thank Reed Forbes, Hallie Smith Richmond, Dave Courtney, who did the brochure. You'll notice it's a step up from what I've been doing the last 22 years. We're grateful today for that. Mike Greco, of course, keeps everything running here. Dan Holler, Kevin Holsworth, Rob Canaveri, June Drood, and Camille, as well as Tyler, one of our newest acquisitions in the advancement office. And this is our blockbuster end to our whole academic year season of forums. And so can we all give them a big hand for this whole year? And of course, a special note of gratitude to all the donors who made this event possible and have made it possible for the last 22 years prior to this year to honor Henry Abraham. There are no Abrahams with us today because there's a new Abraham in Richmond. Henry's first great-grandchild with impeccable Germanic timing was born yesterday in Richmond. Her name is Harper Alice McGowan, and I know Henry and Mildred and that great beyond are so thrilled and proud, but therefore the Abrahams are watching online today. So I started a tradition last year at this event, and I decided to continue it. You've probably heard that some professors give a last lecture. Well, Henry wrote a last essay, and he wrote this essay in the fall of 2019 before he passed in the winter of 2020. And it's about his life as an immigrant, and it is timeless. And so I have decided as a tradition I will read it to you. Henry began, it was 1934, Hitler's second year in power. Parental home since my birth in 1921. Other good center, where I attended an elementary co-ed public school. The bell rang for the customary 20-minute recess, and I hurried out into the courtyard with my fourth-year classmates to play a bit of foosball. When one of the classmates of mine smashed me in the chin, yelling, "Dirty Jew." Henry said, "What did you do that for?" And he struggled to get to his feet, but the boy yelled all the louder, "You are a dirty, slimy Jew." Reporting this disconcerting incident to my parents, Henry said, that evening I cried out to them, "I can't stay in this country anymore. Please send me to America." At the age of 13, I already realized that the United States represents me, the epitome of a free society. 4 years later, my wonderful, determined mother had convinced FDR's anti-Semitic State Department that I would not be a threat to the United States, and I received my visa and intention to become a citizen. Over the strenuous objections of my German father, Henry wrote, a World War I decorated veteran of the Kaiser's army, twice wounded at Verdun fighting the Americans, I left my parents and younger brother in April 1937 for Pittsburgh, where I would live as a refugee with an American Jewish family. My parents and brother followed in 1939, my father's health broken in the concentration camps of Sachsenhausen and Dachau, following Kristallnacht in November 1938. He would die in Pittsburgh, an American citizen, in 1951. Though considered an enemy alien after Germany declared war on the United States in December of 41, I was drafted, Henry said, into the US Army. It was there that he was recruited into what would be called the Ritchie Boys. These were 1,985 German Jews selected to form a force to help win the war in Europe. Camp Ritchie, Henry said, in Maryland became the legendary center for training in an 8-week session. An elite force of fluent German and French-speaking commissioned and non-commissioned intelligence officers. I was particularly happy that we were fast-tracked for U.S. citizenship before being sent overseas to interrogate German POWs and the liberated French citizens. 7 years after I had escaped the Nazis' grasp, I returned to Germany as a Ritchie boy, an American citizen, and a U.S. Army second lieutenant to my birthplace, war-torn Offenbach, and attended a poignant service in my boyhood synagogue. I sat in a pew with my elementary school teacher, a Protestant, holding my hand throughout the liturgy. His support of my studies had cost him his job in 1934. And Henry ended his last essay. I devoted my life and career to the study of constitutional law and history because I had learned firsthand how quickly a democracy can devolve dictatorship. And that's why we're so grateful to have Judge Luttig here today to talk to us about this. Just a word about questions. If you have them for the judge, we will allow plenty of time today so you can write them down on a card. Alfred will pick them up and they will come up to me then. And also if you are our online audience, you may use the Q&A function to submit your question to us. Now to Judge Luttig, a native of Texan. I've been enjoying his lilt, his Texas lilt today as he's visited the Miller Center, which he says is for the first time. So we're so glad that he's here. He received his undergraduate degree here in Virginia at Washington and Lee, and his law degree from the University of Virginia. His extensive public service includes while working for Chief Justice Warren Burger in the office that he established called the Office of the Assistant to the Chief Justice, where I was able to serve as a Supreme Court fellow in the mid-1990s. In addition to that public service, Judge Luttig also served as a law to Judge Scalia, and you might say judge, not justice, Judge Scalia on the DC Circuit, but he also then went on to clerk at the Supreme Court for Chief Justice Warren Burger. An assistant White House counsel for Ronald Reagan, Judge Luttig then served as an assistant attorney general in the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel during the Bush 41 presidency, and to the Fourth Circuit in 1991, where he served until 2006. And you probably know that Virginia is in the Fourth Circuit. They are based in Richmond. After private sector service with Boeing and Coca-Cola, Judge Luttig, I'm going to put in quotes, retired. As Serena Williams says, he's evolving. I think we all are evolving. And he makes his home now in Colorado. So we're especially grateful that he flew across the country for this event. As you probably know, he testified before the state's House Select Committee last summer on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, expressed his opposition to election deniers. And I can say that Professor Abraham so admired Judge Luttig, and I know would be so happy to have him speaking for him today. He certainly admired his service on the Fourth Circuit and hoped that he would serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. And I know Henry would agree with me that Judge Luttig's courage in supporting our democratic republic has earned him Longfellow's poetic encomium, as Henry would say. I love that word. And it was cited by Justice O'Connor to describe Chief Justice Burger. And I quote from Longfellow and Justice O'Connor, "The heights by great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night." With that, please welcome Judge Luttig.
Translate that gracious introduction for you. That is that I'm getting old, and please to me. I try not to ever go off script. As a former federal judge, it's dangerous, but I think I must this one time. This is my first time to the Miller Center, even though I first set foot on this campus almost half a century ago. And I've always been an admirer of this center, but never been here. So when I arrived here this morning, I was really just in awe of everything I saw. As I walked through the halls and saw the magnificent photographs, I thought to myself, I've carried the bags for many of these great Americans, but proudly carried their bags for many years, beginning, hearkening back to what Ronald Reagan said when he returned to Washington and said that he saw the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, and Dave Gergen. And so it was when I walked in the door and saw a photograph of David Gergen, the first person in Washington, D.C. that I worked for in an administration that the young audience not even have heard of, that is President Gerald Ford in 1976. But I will say is that I see some very, very special longtime friends in the audience today, and want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Professor Howard, I don't want to embarrass you, but all that I know about the law I learned from him, whether he wants to admit that or not. John Jeffries, thank you so much for coming. And then of course, I'm going to try to get through this without tears, but in any event, thank you so much. So it's a humbling honor to be invited to give the Henry Abraham Distinguished Lecture at the Miller School. Professor Abraham's friend and admirer and my mentor, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, told the university's venerated professor that no less an authority than the Supreme Court of the United States strives to be worthy of Henry Abraham's trust and respect. I too will strive to be worthy of Professor Abraham's trust and respect in this lecture today in the legendary Professor Abraham's honor. We the people in 1787 ordained and established our Constitution in order to form a more perfect union. Today, just over 3 years shy of the 250th anniversary of our nation's birth, the institutions of our democracy and of law are under vicious, unsustainable, unendurable attack from within. And American democracy and the rule of law are in peril. America and we Americans are at a perilous crossroads. Who is it that we have become? And what is it that America has become? Is this who we want to be? Is this what we want America to be? And if not, just who is it that we Americans want to be? And just what is it that we want our America to be? Speaking in a time of not dissimilar tumult in America nearly 2 centuries ago, Abraham Lincoln urged a revival to the Constitution and the rule of law, a renewed reverence to that great charter for our governance and guarantor of our liberty. Lincoln sermonized with the reverence that he urged, let the Constitution and the rule of law become the political religion of the nation. America is in desperate need of such a revival to our Constitution and the rule of law, as our 16th president urged in 1838. A reawakening and a quickening to the reverential imperatives of the Constitution from which today we have strayed so very, very far. America is adrift. We Americans have lost our moral compass that has pointed us true north since the founding. And with the loss of our direction, we have lost all perspective. We need to reunite once again around the much more that we agreed upon and that bound and united us since our founding. And we need to find the perspective we have lost as to the much less that we disagree upon and that now divides and disunites us. Winston Churchill said that courage is rightly described as the first of human qualities, because courage is the quality which guarantees all others. It's going to take the courage and the courage to support, protect, and defend our imperiled democracy, Constitution, and rule of law in what promises to be the trying years ahead. The evidence of the precarious state of our democracy and law abounds. And so it is that these perils are the most fundamental issues facing our nation today. This 236 years since the founding of ours, the greatest nation in the history of civilization. Poll after poll over the past few years shows plunging respect and support for the institutions of democracy and law. An ominous Quinnipiac poll in the fall showed that even America's two political parties, the political guardians of our democracy, believe that the nation's democracy is in danger of collapse. Mirroring the same concerns of our population at large, nearly 3/4 of both Republicans and Democrats agreed that our democracy appears to be on the verge of collapse. The effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election and the attack on the United States Capitol to prevent the joint session of the Congress from counting the votes for the presidency was a grave and unprecedented offense against our democracy and against our rule of law. Yet, according to one recent poll, roughly 1 in 4 Republicans today say that they approve of the former president's supporters taking over the Capitol during the January 6th attacks. This poll found that 27% of Republicans strongly or somewhat approve of the rioters' attempts on January 6th to prevent the joint session from counting the electoral votes for the presidency. And 2.5 years later, Republicans have again circled the wagons around their former president and now presumptive standard bearer in 2024, who attempted to overturn that 2020 presidential election. Both of these surveys are stunning, and they're grim admissions and confessions of what we Americans believe today about our democracy and our rule of law. Today, still in the forefront of the nation's conscience, is that fateful day in January 2021. The treacherous plan to overturn the 2020 presidential election at any cost so that the former president could cling to power that the American people had decided to confer upon the next president of the United States instead, was no less ambitious than to steal America's democracy. And today, 2.5 years later, in continued defiance of our Constitution and democracy, the former president and his political party allies still claim that the 2020 election was stolen from the former president, despite their knowing that every shred of evidence proves that claim to be false. All the insistence that the former president won the election has laid waste to Americans' confidence in their government, their elections, their democracy, and in the Constitution. As we now understand, false claims that our elections have been stolen from us corrupt our democracy, as they corrupt the nation, and as they corrupt us. So as we gather here This morning, our democracy still remains in harm's way, if not in the way of even greater harm today than yesterday. At the same time that our democracy is imperiled, the American public's faith in the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the rule of law is in spiraling decline too. The January 6th Select Committee to investigate the attack on the Capitol recommended that those responsible for that attack and for the obstruction of the proceedings of the joint session be prosecuted. And 2.5 years later, the nation awaits the decision by the Attorney General and others as to whether those responsible will be held accountable under the Constitution and laws of the United States for their offenses. With the passage of time, the American public has understandably begun to sigh and shrug in hopeless resignation that the law perhaps does not apply equally to all after all. Confidence in the Supreme Court, the guardian of the Constitution and the rule of law, is also on the wane. The most recent polling on the court shows that not even a majority of the American public views our nation's highest court favorably, with a large majority viewing it unfavorably. The largest percentage of the public to view the court unfavorably in the past 3 decades, in fact. The tragic and unprecedented breach of the Supreme Court's confidential deliberative process represented by the leak of the draft opinion in Dobbs, the opinion that only months later overruled Roe versus Wade, only added self-inflicted insult to the high court's already and now still continuing self-inflicted injuries. And most recently, the Supreme Court has come under withering attack for ethical lapses, if not more, and for the critical, reasonless, and institutionally damaging refusal to subject itself to standards of ethical conduct like those to which all other federal judges have long been bound. As we speak today, because the court has stubbornly refused to act, Congress is debating whether it should prescribe standards of conduct for the Supreme Court. I was recently asked to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee at its hearing to consider this question. I told the Judiciary Committee that the day should never come when the Congress of the United States is obliged to enact laws prescribing the ethical standards applicable to the non-judicial conduct and activities of the Supreme Court of the United States, even though it indisputably has the power under the Constitution to do so. Neither should the Congress want to have to prescribe ethical standards of conduct for the Supreme Court. By the same token, I explained, the Supreme Court should not want Congress to prescribe ethical standards for the court either. Rather, the Supreme Court should want to subject itself to the highest possible professional and ethical standards without quibble, such is beyond reproach, such that it is beyond reproach. From its senseless defiance. Our nations are and constitutionally responsible for the protection of law have for years waged relentless war on the rule of law themselves, all the while professing lament at laws nearing politicization and bewilderment at its cause. For years, our presidents collectively have cynically appointed to judicial position not those who are assured will uphold the laws and are possessed of the constitutional view of the proper role of the judiciary, but rather those who they are assured share their own political, social, and policy views and will enshrine those views in the Constitution once appointed. This in surrender, of course, to their respective partisan political parties' demands, and of course, in abdication of their constitutional obligation. Faithful adherence to the law and to the rule of law has been relegated to a lesser qualification for the office. If, one must wonder, it remains a qualification at all. Our Congress must accept equal, if not greater, responsibility for the politicization of law, as we have seen repeatedly, up to including the most recent partisan confirmation spectacles. Congress routinely demands that candidates for judicial office declare views, social and political, issue by issue. And it attempts to withhold confirmation from those who do not share its own social policy and political views, constitutionalize those views as a condition of confirmation to the federal bench. There is scarcely a pretense of concern for law, or for that matter, even the rule of law. Far from that, these politicians are breathtakingly explicit as to their partisan political objectives. Depending on the person and his or her party allegiance, the call is that the high court must remain or be made so if it is not, either more Republican or more Democrat. Is it any wonder that appointments to the courts resemble more political campaigns than judicial confirmations? That this naked politicization of the judicial office inevitably leads to the naked politicization of the courts, and in turn to the naked politicization of law itself, cannot be gainsaid. And of course, it has done just that. Where our Supreme Court itself, followed in lockstep by our lower federal courts, has not led that politicization, it has obliged those who have, with decisions that are any more barely disguised acts of raw political will. Increasingly, the court's judicial decisions are transparently more political results in search of legal reason than legal reason in support of legal and constitutional results. It escapes no one's notice that what are supposed to be decisions of law, which under a rule of law should more often than not be opinions of unanimity, are today, more often than not, opinions of fractious dissent. Fractious dissent, not just along the partisan party lines of the presidents who appointed them, but even along the partisan political party lines of the individual justices themselves. What are the odds of such, let alone the consistent odds of such, under a rule of law, we ask? Commenting on the mutually reinforcing effects of politicization of the appointment process and the ever-increasing politicization of the judiciary, the late Justice Scalia lamented, in almost resignation, that perhaps the confirmation process has become what it ought to be. That is, if the courts in the end are to be more instruments of politics than, as constitutionally intended, interpreters of the law. As for our three institutions of government and their contemptible roles in the politicization of law, I would leave you with this today. If the triumph of politics over law is to be, the cause of that triumph will have been the constitutional failure of these three institutions of our government, in whom we, the people, have entrusted the protection and preservation of the Constitution and the rule of law. And the proximate cause of that triumph, that there will be none left with the moral authority needed to stem the tide of law's politicization. Those with the moral authority and the primary constitutional obligation to protect and preserve will have long ago lost that authority. A battlefield casualty of the partisan political war that they themselves have waged on the rule of law. And so it is that it might not be much overstatement, if any, to say that during our lifetimes, this great nation of laws in which we are privileged to live will effectively decide whether it will live by the rule of law or whether it will live by the rule of politics. So all-consuming has become the politicization of our country, our institutions of democracy, and now even our institutions of law. Such, I'm afraid, is the imperiled state of our democracy and rule of law in the year 2023. America can withstand attacks on her democracy and rule of law from without, but she's helpless to withstand them from within. The relentless assaults and attacks on our democracy and rule of law from within that we've witnessed and experienced over the past years are leveled for the purpose and with the objective of drawing into question the very legitimacy of these institutions of law and democracy. These attacks from within our own country, by our own selves, are not contemplated by the Constitution of the United States and are therefore neither accommodated nor accommodatable by that great charter. And make no mistake, these assaults and attacks, they have accomplished their assailants' objectives. The pillars of our democracy and of law are faltering from these attacks as we speak today. Nor is there any reason to expect there to be an end in sight. It's been years now that we've borne witness to, if we have not ourselves participated in these vicious partisan attacks on these bulwarks of our democracy. For years, we've been told by the very people we trust and entrust to protect and preserve these institutions, that these institutions are no longer to be trusted, no longer to be believed in, no longer deserving of cherish and protection. If that is true, then it is because those with whom we have entrusted these institutions have themselves betrayed our sacred trust. And it does seem at the moment that we no longer agree on our democracy or on the rule of law. Nor do we any longer seem to agree on the other ideals, values, and principles upon which America was founded, and that were so faithfully nurtured and protected by the generations and generations of Americans that came before us. Yet, we agree on no other foundational ideals, values, and principles either. All of a sudden, it seems that we are in violent disagreement over what has made America great in the past and over what will make her great in the future. In poetic tragedy, political campaign slogan has become divisive political truth. And there's no reason to believe that agreement about America by we Americans is anywhere on the horizon, if for no other reason than none of our leaders, and so therefore none of us, is interested in agreement, at least for the time being. In the moral catatonic stupor America finds itself in today, it is only disagreement that we seek. And the more virulent that disagreement, the better. We are a house divided, and our poisonous politics is fast eating away at the fabric of our society. This is not who we Americans are, or who we want to be, nor is this America or what we want America to be. American thinker, writer, and now New York Times columnist David French wrote a marvelous article exquisitely titled Queen Elizabeth and the Power That Transcends Politics on the occasion of the Queen Elizabeth's passing. There he wrote, quote, "The politicization of everything is a threat to any nation, but it is especially a threat to our nation." We Americans seem no longer to recognize, in either sense of the term recognize, the virtues that have been taught, instilled, and celebrated in our society and indeed in all of civilized societies since the beginning of time, such as honor, integrity, truthfulness, honesty, humility, selflessness, responsibility, duty, obligation, courage, and country. What would James Madison think of America today? It was he, our fourth president and the father of our Constitution, who declared it a chimerical idea, the supposition that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without virtue, and virtue in its people. Much less do we Americans any longer agree on what is right and what is wrong, what is moral, what is immoral, what is to be valued and what is not. We no longer agree even on what is and is not acceptable conduct and discourse in our supposed civilized society, or for that matter, even on the outer limits of tolerable conduct and discourse in our society. We don't agree on the outer limits. We cannot agree on what is fact and what is fiction, on what is truth and what is falsity. We disagree on what ought to be the law and what ought not to be the law. We do not even agree on what of the law that we agree is law binds us all, and what of it binds only some of us all. Let alone do we agree on how we want to be governed or by whom, or where we go from here and with what shared national ideals, values, beliefs, purposes, goals, and objectives, if any at all. No society, and certainly no democratic society, can long endure with such polarized disagreement over these most fundamental of matters that are essential to any union. America's in need of help, and our help is not going to come from whence it should. Our elected leaders on both sides of the political aisle have shamefully failed us. As of this particular moment, our Republican leaders have especially failed us, and reprehensibly so. In today's America, only the politicians only sponsor partisan incitement, and they traffic in the same. They've purposely led us down the road, not toward the bridging of our differences, but the opposite direction, away from the bridging of those differences. By constitutional order, we, the people of this great nation, confer upon our elected representatives the power that they are then, by solemn constitutional obligation, directed to wield on our behalf and on America's behalf. But today, our politicians live in a different world from the rest of us, a different world than that ordained by the Constitution. They live in a fictional world of divided loyalties between party and country, a world of their own unfaithful making. Today's politicians believe they never have to choose between their partisan party politics and their country, when in fact they are obliged by oath to choose between the two every day. And every day they defiantly refuse to choose, knowingly choosing their bitter, selfish partisanship over our beloved country. In a word, our polarized political leaders have proven themselves unwilling and unable and incapable of leading us. And as a consequence, we are leaderless and rudderless. It's obvious that we can't hobble along much longer, hopelessly divided, politically and governmentally paralyzed, directionless and undecided as to what we want to be, and what we must do in order to become the America that we want to be. To whom do we turn? our political leaders having failed us? Well, the answer lies in the first 7 words of the Constitution, written by the prophets of our nation's founding. We turn to ourselves, to we the people of the United States. We're the ones constitutionally possessed of the power over our governance and thus over our destiny. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We wrote in our Declaration of Independence. Just as we vest and entrust our power in our leaders, so also can we divest them of that entrusted power, or at least divest the demagogues and the charlatans among them who have betrayed us. We began in the midterm elections of 2022 to purge the ranks of our political leaders who betrayed us, and we must continue that purge in the next election and in the next and in the next. Then, as we rid ourselves of those who have betrayed us, we need to ensure that those in whom we place our trust tomorrow understand better than their predecessors do today that they serve as our leaders and are obligated by no lesser authority than the Constitution to represent our interests and our nation's interests at the seat of government, not their interests. Once we've reclaimed our country, our democracy, and our Constitution from the demagogues, then we Americans need to resolve to decide again, as our forefathers and foremothers decided for us before, who it is that we want to be and what it is that we want America to be. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew, Abraham Lincoln would urge us. We must disenthrall ourselves, Lincoln would say, from the bondages of our political demagogues, and then map our own way forward, as did our forefathers and foremothers before us. To begin this task of redefining who we Americans are and what we want America to be, we need to begin talking with each other again as allies and friends, not as mortal enemies, which our politicians have made us out to be, but which we have never been. We need to find our lost perspective, refocus more on the much that matters, that we agree upon and that unites us, and focus less on the comparatively little of importance that we disagree upon and that separates and disunites us today. John Kennedy said, "Let both sides explore what problems unite us, instead of belaboring those problems which divide us." We must look beyond our partisan self-interestedness today to the all that unites us and focus on the shared values, aspirations, and hopes for the future that bind us together into this one nation that we call America. We need to rediscover the truths that we believed once to be self-evident. We need to rediscover and re-examine, if need be, as we always have re-examined, the ideals, the truths, the values, and the principles upon which our country was founded and upon which it has flourished for almost 2.5 centuries. We must reawaken ourselves to the vision, truths, values, and principles, and the hopes and dreams that this country was founded on and which has bound us together into the more perfect union that we, the people, ordained and established. We must turn this government back into the channel in which the framers of the Constitution originally placed it. As Abraham Lincoln said, we need to shore up and reinforce the bulwark of our faltering democracy and rule of law and refortify the institutions of our democracy and law. Preserving virtuous institutions is its own noble purpose, David French put so well. David went on to say, we Americans can and should grasp that nations and cultures need people and institutions who transcend politics. And as we refortify and re-strengthen the sacred institutions of our democracy, we need to inspire among our citizenry a reverential revival to the Constitution and to the rule of law. Above all else, America is a government of laws and not of men. We are desperately in need of a revival that will renew and revitalize the flagging faith of the American people in our Constitution and in the rule of law. It is all of this, and only all of this, not all of that we are being told falsely, that will make America great again. To no surprise, all of this will require the leadership of leaders. And in today's America, there are precious few leaders to be found. Why are there so few leaders? There are so few leaders because we no longer prize the virtues and the disciplines that comprise leadership. Indeed, today we disparage those virtues and we prize their polar opposites. Virtue is the sine qua non of leadership, that without which there is not leadership. I recently spoke at Yale University Law School, and I addressed 3 of the most important virtues that are essential to the leadership that America needs today: honor, humility, and courage. Today, these virtues sound in a distant past from another day and time. But of course, we know that these virtues are ageless and timeless, and these virtues are more needed in our country today than ever before in our history. But far more do not know this than know it. Leadership is honor. It's always doing and saying the right thing, the truthful thing, the honest thing, the hard thing, but the right thing. It's doing and saying the right thing, especially when the temptation is greatest to do or say the easy thing, but the wrong thing. Followers can follow one who lacks honor, integrity, and honesty. And we see that this is what they often do these days, if not increasingly do. But the one who lacks honor, integrity, and honesty is not leading his followers. He is misleading them. He misleads them not to the places his followers should go and should want to go, and to success and to victory, but instead to the places his followers should not want to go and should not go, and to failure and defeat. Leadership is also humility. Humility that understands that one can do nothing alone, that success depends almost entirely on others and comparatively little on oneself. Humility that one does not know all, even if he knows much. Humility that understands that one may be wrong, even that one may well be wrong. Leadership is the humility that wants to know what others think and what others think should be done. It is the humility that understands that one can learn something important, even something invaluable, from every single other. And leadership is courage, the courage of conscience and conviction, the courage to step forward from the crowd and affirm what one believes and what one does not believe. When the crowd believes differently, does not believe, fears to affirm what it believes, or fears to believe at all. And finally, leadership is the courage of decision and action, the courage to decide and decide rightly, to make the right decisions, not the wrong decisions, and the determined courage to act decisively on those right decisions. To be reminded of these virtues of leadership this morning is, at the same time, to understand why there are precious few leaders in America today. Would that we had had the time to cultivate in our leaders today these virtues of leadership that they need but lack to lead this great nation this day, when America is so desperately in need of leaders and leadership and has neither. Would that we would have thought about more, or thought better about these virtues that are essential to leadership yesterday and the day before and the day before that, when instead we were disparaging, belittling, and squandering the virtuousness of America. Would that so many of us had not forgotten, and so many others of us had not failed to understand that it is America's virtuousness that made her great in the first place. That it was her virtuousness that was responsible for her greatness for 2¼ centuries. Would that we would understand today, even if belatedly, that it is only America's virtuousness that will make her great once again. Thank you, University of Virginia. Thank you, Miller Center. It's a high honor to have been invited to deliver the Henry Abraham Distinguished Lecture today.
I think you can see, as I finish my introduction, that the judge has been toiling upward in the night, to quote from Longfellow and Justice O'Connor. We have several questions that have been gathered. If you have a question that you've written down and you would like Alfred Reeves IV to come pick it up, please hand it to him, and preferably write legibly in your best Catholic school penmanship that my mother taught me. So I have a question to lead us off, Judge, and that is, I think that the point that I want to take away today is, what can we do? You have given us a litany of problems we're facing. And at one point I noticed that you said, who can help us? What can we do? And you went back to we the people. And you focused on the ballot box. We can try to find these virtuous leaders, and we can try to get them in office. Do you worry about access to the ballot box and all of the controversy that has come forward about the counting of votes and their legitimacy from both sides? No, you can use yours.
Oh, okay. I do, Barbara. In fact, many in the audience will remember and know that it was first in the New York Times op-ed that I said that Donald Trump, his allies and supporters, are a clear and present danger to American democracy. That was in an op-ed before my testimony. And then, of course, the January 6th committee asked me about that during my testimony. And I said then that I said that not so much at that point because of January 6th, but rather because the former president and his allies and supporters were fast making plans, even at that point, to overturn the 2024 presidential election in the exact same way that they attempted to do in 2020 but failed, but that in 2024 they would try and succeed. And that's a long way of saying that the president, former president, and his allies had already begun laying the groundwork, in this case, in particular in the states, to run the same play in an effort to overturn the 2024 election. And so today, they're that much further along if they are not in a position and poised to do that. The only thing, well, so the country has made a couple of the changes that I said must be made to prevent another January 6th. First, and probably of greatest significance, the Congress at the 11th hour passed a reform to the Electoral Count Act of 1877. That's basically the law that prescribes the process for the counting of the electoral votes by the joint session of Congress. That was, well, first off, it was just a labyrinthian in its terms. You couldn't understand it if you had a lifetime to try. But it also had, call it ambiguities or loopholes that frankly permitted the effort this time. I advised both the House and the Senate for the past year on reform of the Electoral Count Act, and then in the 11th hour, the Congress did pass it, and I said publicly that would all but prevent another January 6th. But the centerpiece of the 2020 effort was something more esoteric. It was called the Independent State Legislature Theory of Interpretation of both the Electors Clause and the Elections Clause of the Constitution. In 2020, it was the Electors Clause that it issued. Under that theory, essentially, as a practical matter, in 2020, Trump and his allies could have the state legislatures appoint electors who would cast their votes for Donald Trump, notwithstanding that the popular vote in the swing states, for instance, had gone for Joe Biden. That's the most aggressive view of the independent state legislature theory. The Supreme Court, this issue rolled up to the Supreme Court in December of 2020, and the Supreme Court knew exactly what was at issue, knew exactly what could occur on January 6th, and declined to take the case. And with several separate writings, such that by the time by January of that year, people believed that there were 5 votes on the Supreme Court, with Amy Coney Barrett's elevation, to embrace the independent state legislature theory. The court declines to decide it. January 6th occurs. We all knew that the court would have to take the case just as quickly as possible. It did in a case out of North Carolina styled Moore versus Harper. That case arises, though, in the context of the Elections Clause, with respect to redistricting. And, in a similar fashion, the theory would hold in the Elections Clause context that the state legislatures have exclusive authority over redistricting and other elections laws for federal elections purposes. And that case was argued on December 7th of 2022. I decided to join Common Cause, one of the respondents in that case that was arguing against the independent state legislature theory. And it was argued and submitted, and literally we're waiting right now to see if the Supreme Court will decide that case, because as some of you may have heard, the North Carolina Supreme Court changed political parties in the last election, and the now Republican Supreme Court overruled Moore versus Harper. And so the Supreme Court of the United States has asked us to brief whether there's still a final judgment, and then most recently whether the case is moot. So I literally woke up yesterday wondering if the court would dismiss the case yesterday. If it does dismiss the case, then we're headed headlong into the same thing in 2024, Barbara.
Thank you, Judge. If Professor Abraham were sitting here in the front row, given his Germanic background, he would be waving at me his alarm clock because he would say, it's high noon and we must stop. But I'm going to use the prerogative of the moderator to ask a question that comes from our audience today, Judge. And it asks you to open the aperture a little bit beyond the institutions of government to look at the fourth estate, that is the media. What is the impact, do you think, of media, and I'm going to add to that social media, in taking us to the point where we are, as you so eloquently stated in your talk today?
Well, I'm a contrarian today on that issue too. You can just assume for purposes today that up until Donald Trump and I shared the same ambivalence, let's call it, about the media, as many of you do and many Americans do. But then came Donald Trump. And, the country's never seen a politician like Donald Trump, and hopefully we'll never see another politician like Donald Trump. This was everything that he, said, and then did, was unlike anything we've ever, heard or seen done. And it was not good. We are, as a country, who we are today, largely because of Donald Trump. And as I was rhetorically asking ourselves, is this who we want America to be? I don't think you do either, but I actually don't think that many Americans do. But we've gotten caught up in this cycle. But still to your question, how the presses want to do these post-mortems on their coverage. So they've been wringing their hands about, did they cover Donald Trump fairly? And at this point, I'm in an ongoing conversation with the national media, for better or worse. And so when they called me about this hand-wringing, I said, this is precisely the wrong time in history for you to be wringing your hands. I said, nothing that you reported made things worse. And actually, if you've ever just reported the facts, it was probably over the past 5 or 6 years. Because if you just report what Donald Trump says every day and quote it, you don't have to comment further. I mean, it stands on its own. And so I actually believe that the press over the past, let's call it 4 years, has served the highest purpose that it possibly could, and that it was intended under the Constitution of the United States to serve.
Well, we'll do one more, Judge. The Miller Center, as you know, is a nonpartisan institution, or at worst, we view ourselves as bipartisan. I see maybe just a tad of partisanship in this question, and it's about the Supreme Court. And it is as follows from our audience: which is a more accurate characterization of the majority voting bloc on the Supreme Court, in quotes, conservative, or, in quotes, activist, partisan Republicans?
Just a tad of.
I was being non-judgmental, Judge.
But look, there's so many lawyers in the room. That the current Supreme Court is the product of 50 years of war for the Supreme Court. War. And the Republicans won that war finally after 50 years with the elevation of Amy Coney Barrett, giving the so-called conservatives a supermajority on the current Supreme Court without the Chief Justice, whom the conservatives don't consider conservative. Now, in truth, what this has been about for 50 years are different values, let's say two different beliefs as to what law is, and in the judicial context, how to interpret the law and the Constitution. So these two different philosophies or jurisprudences, have been, coming down the track at each other for 50 years. Now, and this is all good, well and good, as dangerous as it is. There are never going to be 9 justices on the Supreme Court who agree as to how to interpret the Constitution and the laws of the United States. And it is the single biggest thing possible for the Constitution. But they're never going to agree. Now, into that judicial milieu comes politics. And this is what I was referring to about the abdication of the Congress and the president's responsibilities. I've been in many White Houses where the president appointed members of the Supreme Court. The presidents don't know, and with the greatest of respect to them today, they don't really care. Okay, it's the legal professionals who advise them as to the candidate, and they choose from among the short list of candidates that person who is politically best able to be confirmed. And but that whole process, like I said in my remarks, is inevitably leads to the politicization of law. And so one of the points I made today that to me is, I didn't make it for the first time that I know of. And if I did, it was many years ago in a commencement speech at the University of South Carolina, is that, whatever the reasons, whatever the causes, whoever's responsible, 8-9 years ago, I said we were nearing the complete politicization of law. And we're 7 or 8 years further along on that line toward politicization than we were 7 years ago. I was at a dinner at the Supreme Court last week, and Justice Breyer and Justice Gorsuch were our after-dinner speakers, and they spoke on originalism and textualism, and they were each articulate about their respective, views, but their views are as far apart as possible in the law, with the attendant consequences and meaning for the Constitution, its interpretation, and therefore for the Supreme Court in the years ahead. But you now have theoretically 5 who share. I'm not going to call it Gorsuch's view; he's too new. But who share Nino Scalia's view of constitutional interpretation. So that's a long-winded way, Barbara, of saying that there is some justification and a lot of justification in the minds of the American people and who are not lawyers, who do not follow the court, to believe that the court has become very political at this point, and that's irrespective of the jurisprudences of the individual justices.
Well, I want to leave you with two last thoughts, and they are this. Since we gathered here last year at this time to honor Henry, we now have a new way of honoring him, thanks to General Souter and his outreach to the Supreme Court Historical Society. And our good mutual friend, Judge Luttig, and I both know Jim Duff, my fellow Kentuckian, who is the head of that society, and I've just recently been named to its board. And at the society's annual dinner on June the 5th, they will give out the first Henry J. Abraham Award to a graduate student, a PhD, a young PhD studying Supreme Court history. So Henry's contributions will continue with new generations, just as his family continues with its next generation as of yesterday afternoon. And finally, while it was serious, of course, to hear your eloquent description of the problems that we face, Henry would always say that he got his eternal optimism from his mother, and Henry was fond of quoting the following. He would say, "What not is can still be." And so let us leave with that today, and thank you all for being here to honor Professor Abraham and Judge Luttig.